What's up everybody, this is Ryan from ThinkComputers, and in today's video we're going to take a look at a custom liquid cooling kit from Alphacool. Now we've been fans of liquid cooling here at ThinkComputers for a long time, but we haven't really stepped away from the all-in-one coolers that we've reviewed in the past couple years. That all changes in this video though. We reached out to our friends at Alphacool and asked if they'd be willing to help us design a custom loop for our system. They responded generously, and as you'll see in the video, we ended up with a pretty sweet setup. Special thanks to Dave over at Alphacool for helping us choose all the components for this system and giving us a little bit of insight into the build. We appreciate it. If you have any questions about the components used in this build, I've got a full list of components down in the description. So when Alphacool got back to us and said that they were going to send some components over, we figured we'd get a box of, a few components here and there. Little did we know we were going to get a huge box. It was about 4 feet long, a 1.5 feet tall by 1.5 feet wide. This thing was huge and it weighed a lot. And as you'll see here in a second, there were a ton of components to take a look at in this box, so let's get started. Now before we get started with the build, I'm going to give a rundown of all the components that we're going to use in this system. This includes all the major components like the water blocks, the tubing, the fittings, radiators, and more. Our first component is the Iceblock XPX Aurora. Now this is the Plexi version of the block, and it's really nice. It's got a nice polished finish to the base, as well as a very transparent top to the block. It also has addressable RGBs within the block itself, so you get that really nice lighting. Next up is the Iceblock Aurora Plexi GPX-N for the GeForce RTX 2080 and 2080 Ti Founders Edition cards. Now we are using this with the 2070 Super, so there is compatibility with other cards. Again, we have the really nice clear plexiglass and nice polished metal material that's making contact with your video card. We also have the integrated addressable RGB lighting here as well. For our reservoir, we're using the 150mm version of the Iceblock D5. Now this obviously has the reservoir portion to it, but it also has a base to install your pump, and it has multiple fitting locations for your tubing, so you can have multiple inlet options with a single outlet. There's also multiple mounting brackets included with this so that you can mount this wherever it works inside of your case. Next we have the VPP655 pump. This is a 5-speed pump, and it connects to your power supply with a standard 4-pin Molex connector, and also has a 3-pin connector with a single line out so that you can check the RPM of the pump itself. For our radiators, we went with the NexXxoS ST30 full copper radiators. Now we have both 240mm and 360mm used in our build. We're using a single 240mm at the front and a 360mm at the bottom. One really nice thing to note on these radiators is that the end caps use Alphacool's flush mounted plugs, so they don't get in the way of other components or your case, which really makes installing inside of a case very convenient. And there are openings on each side of the radiator end so that you can orient it in the position that you would like. And there's also an additional drain hole included on these radiators. For our tubing, we're using Alphacool's Alpha Tube. This is the HF16/10, which is a 3/8 inch inner diameter tubing. This is very, very flexible tubing, and we had no issues at all getting this tubing to work with all of our bends and runs within our build. The fans we're using in this build are Alphacool's Eiszyklon Aurora Lux Pro 2 digital RGB fans. These are the 120mm version, and we are using 6 of them in the build total. Now 5 of them will be attached to radiators, and then we have a 6th one at the back of the case. For the fittings, we're using Alphacool's compression fittings and adapters. Now obviously this is a soft tube build, so we're using those compression fittings, and we're using a combination of 90 degree, 45 degree, some swivel fittings, just a lot of options here to make sure that our building process is as easy as possible, and it gives us as much flexibility in addition to the flexible tubing to make sure that we get all the angles to work properly to make sure our flow is unrestricted. And last but not least is the Aurora Ice Control addressable RGB controller. Now this is going to be used to control not only the CPU block and video card block, but also the fans in the system as well. This controller is fully capable of controlling all of those and uses SATA for power. Now that we've covered all the parts for our Alphacool system, it's time to tear down our current build. This is a pretty basic setup with an AIO-cooled CPU and air-cooled video card. With most of the major components now out of the case, it was time to start removing the factory cooling from our air-cooled video card. Now this can be a little intimidating at first, but really it's just a simple removal of a bunch of screws and taking your time to make sure you don't break anything. As long as you follow Alphacool's included instructions for the GPU block, things go pretty easily. They include everything you need for all of these installations, which makes things very handy. Always make sure to clean the integrated heat spreader on your CPU before installing new cooling components. Since we're using an AMD AM4 based motherboard, installing the mounting solution on the CPU block is really simple. You just slide these clips into the sides of the CPU cooler, and then they snap together, holding them in place. Once all the mounting hardware is installed on the CPU block, you can then start threading in the fittings. Installation of the block itself is pretty simple, and once you have it in place, you simply tighten the 4 screws included with the kit. Installing fittings on the GPU block is just as easy as it was on the CPU block, as you can see here. We went ahead and decided to go with a parallel loop in this build. Now, most of the system is in series, so meaning one component feeds to the next and that component feeds to the other. We did decide to go with a parallel loop when it comes to the GPU and CPU cooling. So we have one of our lines going from one of the radiators into the GPU, and then that flow of water splits between the GPU block and the CPU block. Then it exits the GPU and continues through the rest of the system. We chose a parallel loop in this build for a couple of reasons. Number one, we really like the aesthetics and parallel lines that we get. Typically with a parallel loop, you get a lot of symmetry in your tubing and your fittings and all your blocks, so that really looks nice. And second of all, when we're building in the InWin 905, all of our runs just made sense to go with that type of a loop. So now it comes down to the moment of truth. We've got all our components placed back in the case, all the water blocks are on their rightful components, we've got all the tubing into all the fittings. Now it's time to fill the loop up and see if it's got any leaks. Thankfully, our initial leak test was successful. We didn't have any leaking or seepage from any of the blocks or any of the fittings, so it's time to button things up and power up the system for good. As you can see, the system turned out awesome. We really like the look of it, all the digital RGB that we've got going on with all the multiple components. You know, we've got the lighting on the fans, the video card block, we've got the CPU block all lit up and matching. It really looks great, and we're really happy with our results. Stay tuned though, because we are going to be doing a follow-up video to this. Not only did Alphacool send over their soft tubing that we used in this video, but they also sent over some hard tubing as well as hard tubing fittings. We'll be building in a different case, and we'll be using a little different component setup as well. Instead of a 240mm radiator and a 360mm radiator like we have in this build, we'll be going with dual 360s because we'll be building in the InWin 925. As always, thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a like and maybe even a subscribe. And if you have any questions or comments, leave them down below. Thanks, and we'll see you in the next one.